Scott Horton is the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, host of The Scott Horton Show, and author of several books, including his latest, Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott Horton, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me back, Kim. Good to be with you.
Yes, so let's talk about Russia, Ukraine. Let's start off with this. There's so much we could cover with foreign policy, which we're not supposed to have really any issues anymore, because once Donald Trump came into office, we were supposed to end all the wars. But here we are. So much foreign policy to talk about. But let's talk about first Russia and Ukraine. This one's interesting because, I got to say that when I was hopeful that Trump would get into office and end this war, I didn't actually think it through how. It was just like, yeah, he says he's going to end the war. And I think we're all like, yeah, okay. He's acknowledging that the expansion of NATO and there's these other things that provoked this whole conflict. But now I don't know how I don't know how Russia ends it. I don't know how what Russia would need in order to say, all right, we're going to end this. What do you think?
Well, I'm with you, and I've been pessimistic about this. I think that Trump was sincere in running on ending the war. I don't know if he really believed he could just end it with a snap of the fingers. In fact, he did say at one point that he could end it before he was even sworn in. He was just going to take care of it during the transition. Let Biden invoke the Logan Act again. I just want to go ahead and do this. But the problem is, of course, you look at the way all the pieces are set out on the board. America is in a position of weakness here. The Russians are in a position of strength on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are getting their clocks cleaned in, somewhat slow motion, but in an inexorable type of a conflict where the Russians just have them beat in manpower, in industrial power, and in financial power to continue the war going and continue to make steady progress at the expense of the Ukrainian military in a way that, Russians are dying too, but they can replenish their forces much more easily than the Ukrainians can. And so it's always just been a matter of time, essentially. And then, So in a way, Trump was sworn in at a very unfortunate time. In the sense that, like, as much as he might want to end the war, he's not really in any position to do so.
Yeah.
He can't threaten Russia really with anything. We already, the United States under Biden already tried pouring in every kind of missile system and putting in Abrams tanks and all of these things. And they can make a marginal difference on the battlefield, but they're never going to turn the tide of the war. The HIMARS and the ATACMS and this and that. And so the February threat assessment from the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, confirms this truth that the Russians are winning.
Yeah.
So Trump can threaten sanctions, but boy, Biden already tried that too, right? We have every kind of sanction in the world, and Trump was reduced to threatening this kind of nuclear sanctions option that he would put like a complete, 100% tariff on any country that does any business with Russia. But he's not going to do that. He'd be crazy to do that. There'd be so many countries would just say, fine, Russia's much closer and we'll just get our raw materials from them instead of you then, or whatever it is. It would backfire. It's going way too far, and it's just, he's out of cards to play. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, he does have carrots, and he has clearly spoken about this and offered this. This was in the 7-point plan that they had talked about, where, we'll normalize relations with Russia. We'll lift all the sanctions, Trump said, going back to 2014. So, we're just not doing the Cold War. We're canceling it, and we want to normalize, and we want to get along with you for the long term again. So that should be pretty enticing to Vladimir Putin. And if there are angels, they ought to be poking him and making him go along. That, look, this is the best deal you're ever going to get. There's nothing more important to Moscow than their relationship with the United States of America for the long term. There's just nothing that matters more. We got all the H-bombs, us and them. And so this is the conflict that just cannot be. So, And he understands that, but his men are winning on the battlefield, and yet they've only taken 99% or so, 98% of Luhansk, but they've only taken 2/3 of Donetsk. And they've only taken like half of Zaporozhye and Kherson. Half of Kherson's on the other side of the river. They don't own that. And yet they've officially annexed all 4 of those territories and every inch of them and incorporated them by law into the Russian Federation now. But their soldiers don't stand on that ground. So then in their demands, they're saying, well, the Ukrainians are going to have to withdraw from all 4 of those provinces on any territory that they still hold in those provinces. I don't know if Zelensky could even order his men to do that. Especially some of these neo-Nazi brigades like Andrei Beletsky's 3rd Separate Infantry Division or Azov Corps. They might just keep fighting and ignore his authority if he says that, he orders them back from there. They might just shoot him in the face, as Dmitry Yarash and Andrew Beletsky have threatened in the past, that any president tries to deal with Russia, they'll just kill him because they're not going to, settle for that sacrifice of all these good men for no good reason. They haven't died in vain until Ukraine sues for peace. Then they've died in vain. And so they want to keep fighting on the radical right in Ukraine. And the Russians, first of all, they're still short of controlling all 4 provinces that they've officially annexed. But also, in reality, they're also there in northern Luhansk. They're spitting distance from Kharkiv, which is a very important Russian city. It might be a hell of a fight to take that city from the Ukrainians. They might have to bomb the hell out of it and force the civilian population out. But then at some point, if they keep fighting, they could walk right in and take that city back. Same thing for Odessa, the jewel of the Black Sea, Ukraine's all-important port city there to the west of the Crimean Peninsula. And which is, again, a historically Russian city that many certainly to Putin's right are demanding that he keeps going until he takes all of that territory back. And see, Kim, by the logic of government programs, this is the way this always works. It's the same for the Russians as it is for the Americans. Once they intervene, they create new problems, and then they got to intervene further and further and further, come up with new ways to try to fix the problem that they just created. So think about it from the Russians' point of view now, where they've just incorporated the most heavily Russian areas of Ukraine, the ethnically Russian areas of Ukraine. But there's, it's a gray sliding scale, right? You have a lot of people who are of mixed ethnicity or more Ruthenian or Ukrainian ethnicity, and yet are Russian speakers still, and are maybe culturally Russian, and are maybe not quite as Russian as people in Donetsk, but still are a hell of a lot more Russian than the people in Lviv, right? And so it's not just the Donbass. There's also, I can never say it right. I usually make fun of it. It's such a crazy word. It's Dnipropetrovsk or whatever, which is the giant province between the river and the Donbass, right? And the river does this big hook from your direction, looking this way. It's a big hook this way, but there's still this big province between Kiev and the river and the Donbass, all Russian speakers and mostly agricultural land and whatever, but still. So now if you're the Russians, what are you doing? You're taking all of the people who are really pro-Russia out of the country by drawing your new line around them. You're making them now Russians, not pro-Russian Ukrainians anymore. And you're leaving the only Russian-speaking or potentially Russian-leaning Ukrainians now as a vast minority in the country, right? A tiny minority compared to when they used to be a 50-50 split and even win elections. That's why America had to overthrow the government there twice, right? So from the logic of Putin's point of view, from the Russians' point of view, you got to keep fighting until you take all that land all the way to the river to protect those people. That's the name of the state, right? What are we going to do? Leave these people outside of our protection where the new terribly anti-Russian regime will surely persecute them, right? That becomes the excuse to then go even further. And then there's also this strip of land called Transnistria, which is on the Ukrainian-Moldovan border. It's on the Moldovan side of the river, but it's occupied by Russian troops. And about a third of the population are ethnic Russians. It was like a vacation spot during the Soviet Union days, and they stayed. And so they're under Russian protection there in this tiny little strip of land. Well, from some Russian planners' point of view, it must only make sense to not just take Odessa, but keep on going all the way till you've taken the entire Black Sea coast and all of Transnistria. And what's stopping them? The only thing stopping them is time and money. But their budget is not broken yet. They're still able to keep going, clearly. And there's the time that it'll take them to do it. And there's the lost opportunity for a sound peace with the United States of America and the rest of the West. So that's what Putin has to balance. All this territory essentially almost within his grasp, or get along with Donald Trump. And see, the problem is if he just doesn't make peace and he keeps going, then he makes a chump out of Trump, right?
Yeah.
He makes Trump terrible. And Trump's going to take that personally. And then we have a worse problem, that here we had a huge opportunity for peace, but just too bad Trump wasn't inaugurated in 2026 instead of 25, because at this point, he's got the Russians right where they don't want to quit. And then again, at the same time, and we've seen this, it's not clear that the Ukrainians want a deal either. And I guess they're betting on the Europeans to continue to finance them in the war. And possibly Zelensky has very personal reasons for staying in it, like he's afraid of the right wingers, or, he's just addicted to the power and doesn't know what's going to happen after the war is over and the loss is finally blamed on him, or whatever is going through his mind. He can't believe that he can win. He can't believe that with just the right help from the French and the Germans, he can turn the tide in this thing. It's not that. But he doesn't seem to really want a deal. And after all, he's in the position of weakness. He's in the position of almost total defeat. So if he's calling time out here, it's just so that things don't get worse. And like I said, he's got some real Nazis to his right, including, Beletsky, who's going to be like a war hero in this thing if he survives the war, who has threatened to murder him already if he dares to sue for peace. So he is really in a rock and a hard place situation himself. So it's terrible that Biden particularly, and Putin for his part, of course, too, did this and got this war started, because now we have a president who swears this would have never happened on his watch, and he's going to end it now, but he's just not in a very good position to.
Right. I mean, that's the big problem. Zelensky is an anomaly because he's really, he just seems so bizarre that he's not willing to come to a peace agreement. But if you look at the fact that he has, a hit out on him, if he does say, okay, it's time for peace. But then it just seems like, okay, well, then you would do what every other leader has done when this happens, and you escape off to Europe or to the United States, and you live, and that's where you go out, and seek exile. So
this is what we said 2 years ago. It's either Brookings or a bullet.
Yeah,
that's Zelensky's fate, right?
Seems like he would just have left by now and said, all right, peace.
Hey, he could be a congressman like Alexander Vindman's brother Eugene. Yevgeny. They renamed him Eugene so that people wouldn't say, am I really voting for a congressman named Yevgeny, who's the brother of this Ukrainian who impeached the president?
Yeah.
What a weird story.
So one thing Trump keeps bringing up, and I don't know if you have any insight onto this, but Trump keeps saying that there's satellite imagery of fields of dead soldiers on both sides, that it's just the worst thing he's ever seen. It looks like World War II, where it's just loads and loads of dead soldiers. I mean, we've seen a lot of imagery, but I am not seeing that. So how is that true? Are there just fields of dead soldiers?
I don't know.
And we're not seeing them?
Look, okay, the first thing going into this is Trump just exaggerates everything, right? So they tell him, look, we've given Ukraine about $200 billion. And then he goes, we've given Ukraine $350 billion. Because that's just the way he talks, right? He's from Queens. He has to embellish every single thing about him because that's just how they were in his neighborhood growing up or whatever. So he just embellishes everything. So we've all seen, as you say, just horrific images of just absolute butchery, murder, and all these guys getting blown up by artillery shells and tank rounds and drones and bullets, people getting blown to bits out there. And then you read reports of guys dying out in the field. Sometimes they freeze to death or they just bleed out. There's no one to take them. There's no ambulances, or there's no wounded recovery capability like we, would wish that they could have. They just don't have it. And so people are suffering out there, and the comparison has often been made to World War I, where you have like trenches and a lot of times freezing mud and rats. And then again, tank and artillery shells. So these giant craters, people just being blown up in these huge explosions and just absolute hell on earth. But I think it's broadly understood that it's and plus drones though, World War I plus drones, but scaled way down in terms of the number killed a day. We're like in World War I, you're talking about 10 or 20 or 30,000 people killed in a day, right? Like just entire massive divisions of men poured onto machine gun nests that just have the range to keep them at bay and just will not let them get close. And they just keep pouring troops on and on and on. And it's just not enough to actually reach the machine gun nest, but it's enough for everybody to die trying. And that there were scenes like that at the Somme and other places in World War I, where it's just, you couldn't believe it. We don't have that volume of men being poured on hardened positions in this war that I have seen. And I've seen a lot of ugly telegram footage and what have you of people being blown up.
Right. And that's the thing is I've seen lots and lots of terrible footage, but I'm not seeing the satellite imagery that Donald Trump is talking about. And I feel like if it existed, we would have seen it.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, certainly if they could show us, look, here are all the Russians. You know, they like to show pictures of a pile of dead Russian bodies and, you know, like Vietnam. Look at our body count. See, we are getting the guys and whatever, even though it's really misleading as to what it all amounts to in the end. But yeah, I agree with you. And I think both sides always play down their own casualties and play up the other side. And so I always just go with the more conservative estimates all the way around. So if people are saying that 1 million people have been killed, I think it's probably more like 500,000 and probably about evenly split. So,
do you think that's actual deaths or is that casualties?
On each side seems like probably a good, maximum somewhere around there. Which I know really like a lot. That's really a gut feeling kind of a thing, but it's just splitting the difference in everybody else's claims.
That just still seems like a lot. Do you think that's, and a lot of people get confused with the term casualties. So, when we hear casualties, people think, oh my gosh, that many dead people. But really, it's just wounded or dead, right? Just taken off the battlefield.
I would bet it's probably 300,000 dead. And
you think so? That many?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it's been 3 years of a hell of a lot of fighting out there and some very pitched battles in some places. So, yeah, certainly, I can't imagine it's 1 million dead. I'd be very surprised if it's 1 million dead, as some are saying. If it was near 1 million overall casualties, or if it was like high hundreds of thousands of killed and wounded, that sounds probably appropriate to me. Yeah.
Usually, I think the wounded is like 3 times the amount of death. It's like typical, maybe more
it does
these days.
The type of warfare, whether it's this kind of open battles between state armies versus counterinsurgency warfare, fighting ghosts with landmines, that kind of thing.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of this and what you wrote about in your book, Provoked, how Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. This is where I struggle is, first of all, just give us a quick rundown of how Washington, how Russia was provoked by us, by the U.S.
Sure. Well, so it started in the H.W. Bush years, where they promised, Bush Sr. himself made the first promise, we won't take advantage if you let the Warsaw Pact states go. And then his government and also the British and German government promised over and over again, we promise not to expand NATO. Now they claim that just James Baker said that one time and it was only about troops inside Germany and making East Germany part of NATO, and they revised that and this and that. And they claim to have debunked it. And there was just a new article the other day claiming to debunk it. Well, I have rebunked it in the book. It's absolutely clear that they promised not just about Eastern Germany, which wouldn't have made any sense to reunite Germany, but not have the East in NATO. That's not the deal. The deal was we promised not to expand east of Germany if you allow reunification of Germany inside the NATO alliance. Because after all, you don't want Germany independent with their own nuclear weapons. You want Germany to stay in NATO under American control, don't you? And they said, yeah, actually, now that you put it that way, we do. But promised not to move any further east than that. And that absolutely was the deal, although it wasn't in the treaty, but it absolutely was the understanding upon which all of these major decisions were made to withdraw Soviet troops from Germany and from Eastern Europe. So then they ended up overthrowing the whole dang Soviet Union, and all of Eastern Europe, and even Belarus and Ukraine and the Baltic states all went free. The South Asian states all were let go, and the Soviet Union ceased to exist on Christmas Day, 1991. So the promises had been made, a year and a half before, or almost 2 years before. They didn't even know the Soviet Union was going to cease to exist. They just wanted the Warsaw Pact to end and all the commie sock puppet governments in Eastern Europe to be overthrown and let there be real elections and independence there. So they ended up getting the demise of the whole dang thing. So, but again, it was based on all these American assurances that we're going to be good sports about all this, when in fact they were planning all along not to be good sports about it. They were planning all along to expand the American military alliance, NATO, into Eastern Europe at Russian expense. And they knew that this meant that all their talk about erasing dividing lines in Europe were lies. And that what they really meant was they're moving the dividing line east. They're going to bring more countries under America's skirt, under our nuclear umbrella, under our protection at Russian expense. And no, Russia is not invited to join. It's an anti-Russian alliance, and no matter how many times they ask to be part of it, they always get the cold shoulder. And there were so many people, Kim, in the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton years who said we should not expand NATO at Russian expense. Even Brent Scowcroft, George H.W. Bush's right-hand man, and many others, including Bill Clinton's secretaries of defense, Les Aspin and William Perry, all just said we should not do this. And they said, if we are going to expand NATO, William Perry said, well, we should bring Russia in first. And then that way, it's not all at their expense. And then all the countries in the middle, when we bring them all in, just everybody's neutrality is assured. And they came up with these schemes. They claimed that the CSCE, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, later the OSCE for organization, but same thing. And then later the Partnership for Peace, that these would replace NATO. You don't have to worry about NATO expansion because NATO is not even going to be a military organization at all anymore. NATO is going to be more of a political organization where we kind of insist on an independent judiciary and, regular elections and this kind of stuff. Think of it like the EU plus America. And we're going to replace NATO as a military alliance with these new security arrangements because there is no enemy. So we don't need an alliance. Instead, we're going to have a security partnership. And you, Russians, will be part of it with us and with everybody else. And when they talked about the CSCE, all the Eastern European countries were already members of the CSCE, including Ukraine and Russia and everything else. So everybody, there was no conflict. The lack of conflict was baked into the thing by having everyone join at once in this way. But the thing is, Kim, my point is, they were always lying. They always knew that they were really just shining the Russians on and telling them what they needed to hear to acquiesce and give in to American plots and plans that over the long term, we're going to end up expanding as far as it goes. And then, again, there were so many, never mind Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan and all these wonderful guys who called it right, Ted Carpenter and all these people who were completely against it, who were like our heroes, who of course were right. But no, you had 2/3 of the membership of the Council on Foreign Relations were against NATO expansion. You had the supermajority of the American foreign policy establishment said we should not be doing this, and including George Kennan and all the leading lights said that this is going to generate a reaction, and then the same people saying it's going to be fine are going to be the people saying, see, that's just how the Russians are, and that's why we have to do this. When it's doing this is what's making them that way, and that's exactly how it's going to play out, and then that's exactly how it played out. So then this includes, there are all kinds, the book is this thick because I didn't know what to leave out. So there's shock therapy, there's the Balkan Wars, which was at the expense of the Russians' friends, the Serbs. There's all the color-coded revolutions virtually against all Russia's friends in their near abroad, including in Serbia, in Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, 3 failed attempts to overthrow the government of Belarus, and the promise of NATO expansion to Georgia and Ukraine. And Ukraine, of course, has always been a special case here because, as we've talked about, we have these huge Russian populations. Vladimir Lenin drew that border in 1921 to leave this Russian territory, the Donbass and what they called Novorossiya, the southern coast there, and make that all part of Ukraine instead of leaving it part of Russia, because one, I think they wanted ethnic Russians there to balance and be more pro-Soviet and pro-Moscow, and have that population inside Ukraine. But then also they wanted Ukraine to be somewhat self-sufficient as its own industrial state, as part of the Soviet Union and all that. But still, like all those, and it was supposed to be the new Soviet man, where there's no such thing as nationality anymore. Everybody is all the same under the new communist regime and all of that kind of stuff. So, but the border had been drawn in a very wonky place. And when Ukraine declared independence in 1991, there almost broke out into conflict right then, because they were saying, well, geez, if you guys they thought that Ukraine was going to stay in some kind of union with Russia. And when they realized that, no, that's not true, they said, oh, yeah, well, maybe we'll just take back the Donbass and Crimea then, because that belongs to us. If you guys are just going to, it was the communists that gave that to you. So we just take it back again. And then the only reason they didn't go to war then was because they were trying to suck up to the United States. And they thought that was more important. Yeltsin thought that was more important. And so let the issue slide. But see, in the Bill Clinton years, in the W. Bush years, in the Barack Obama years, in the Donald Trump years, you had professional, centrist foreign policy establishment leaders, the graybeards, former secretaries of state, and all the think tank wonks from Brookings and CFR, and these type places, the most official type people, not dissident foreign policy people, but mainline foreign policy people, said, of course, we're going to have to make a special exception for Ukraine. I mean, and that includes Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who both, as former national security advisors, are like the leading grand strategists of American foreign policy on the Democratic and Republican side for generations, going back to the 70s, late 60s for Kissinger. And even they said, well, of course, we have to make a special exception for Ukraine because you have this massive ethnic Russian population inside the country. And there's a guy named Ken Pollock, who is very famously like a liberal hawk who helped push for Iraq War II, one of the guys who helped convince Democrats that it was a good idea to support Bush in the war. And he wrote a monograph in 2018 saying we need to come up with a whole new security structure for far Eastern Europe here. And we need to, and they all invoke, they all invoke the Austria model or the Finland model from the old Cold War. And in the last Cold War, Finland and Austria stayed neutral. And they didn't have Soviet troops or American troops, and they weren't part of NATO or the Warsaw Pact. And they were allowed to stay as neutral territories during the whole Cold War era. And so they all would invoke that and say, well, of course, we need to do the Austrian model for Ukraine. Because if the West tries to truly move Ukraine into our orbit and away from Russia's, it's going to lead to a war. And this is, famous. I'm sure you're familiar with the Niet means Niet memo from February of 2008. And this is the guy who ended up becoming Joe Biden's head of the CIA, William Burns. And at that time, he was the ambassador to Moscow. And he wrote a memo to his boss, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And it's called Niet means Niet. And he says he's gone all around Moscow. He's talked to everybody at all the think tanks. He's talked to the most enlightened liberals. And he says in the darkest, the most backwards knuckle draggers in the darkest recesses of the Kremlin. And everybody in between, in the entire foreign policy establishment consensus in Moscow is you better not try to bring Ukraine into NATO. Not Georgia either, but especially not Ukraine, dude. Don't do it. You are going to put us in such a terrible position if you do that, because primarily of, one, all these ethnic Russians in the country, but also the Sevastopol naval base, the all-important Sevastopol naval base at the Crimean Peninsula, which is the home of the Black Sea Fleet ever since the 1780s. And they're not giving it up. And they don't put this into contention. And Sergei Lavrov, the current and then foreign minister, tells Burns, and Burns tells Rice, look, I talked to Lavrov, and Lavrov told me, he said, this is the brightest of red lines for us. And because we can see what's going to happen. If you go to move Ukraine into NATO, it could cause a civil war inside Ukraine. Could cause a massive division and even a civil war. And then if that happens, Russia might be forced to have to decide whether to intervene a choice we don't want to have to face. Right? So this is as close as Sergei Lavrov can get to being on his knees begging, don't put us in this position, Burns. You know me, and I mean it. And Burns says it ain't just him, and it ain't just Putin. It's all of them are begging us not to do this. He followed up with a personal email to her, which he quotes in his own memoirs about it, where at one point you can tell he gets frustrated as he's writing it. He says, "Madam, if I haven't convinced you so far, you might as well just quit reading now. I'm running out of things to say to you to try to get you to listen to me." And then he says in his memoir that he thought that Rice agreed with him. Now, we don't know. I don't know. Maybe there are books that say this, but I don't know what Rice told Bush about this. But he said he thought Rice agreed with him. And we know that Gates agreed with him, although we don't know what Gates told Bush either. But we know that Gates absolutely was against, because he was against NATO expansion in the first place, although I think he was kind of soft on it in 2004. But he was certainly against the first round. And then he slammed Bush in his second memoir and said this was vast overreach. And I forget all of his adjectives, but he's like insulting toward Bush's negligence in doing this. It was an absolute horrific idiot thing to do, according to Robert Gates, who was then the Secretary of Defense.
Right, but here's the thing. Here's the thing, Scott, is that we didn't bring Ukraine into NATO. In fact, every time Ukraine wanted to, there was always this, we'll bring you into NATO, and then it was they never were allowed into NATO. It was just
that's the key. That's the key, Kim, because and I agree with all the hawks on this part, although I disagree with their conclusion, of course. But there's so many experts, university professors and think tankers and wonks and officials who have said this is the worst of all worlds. Because what Bush did was at Bucharest, was he said, we're going to give you a membership action plan. You're not getting one. And even a membership action plan is sort of a half-assed maneuver. But essentially what he said was, you are on the pathway, right? You are going to become a member one day, which was all he was doing, was getting them in trouble with the Russians without giving them any kind of war guarantee. So then all the hawks and everybody says this is the worst of all worlds, right? Essentially pushing them to get into a fight without promising to come and protect them. Now the hawks all say, of course, that he should have just given them a war guarantee right then and there. That damn Angela Merkel and everybody else that he knows is the right thing to do, and just go ahead and give them an Article 5 guarantee. But the thing is, I believe that if he had done that Putin would have just invaded that weekend. That he would have just said, you know what, I'm calling your bluff, and that would have been it. Because I think they just absolutely would not have accepted that. But I think what they should have done instead, though, right? What's the opposite of this half-assed promise that they never really meant? Would be to repudiate it and just say, look, we love Ukraine and we're going to always be friends with Ukraine, but we're not in a position really to guarantee their independence. And so we're not going to, right? And instead what they did was they pushed this interoperability which means America essentially taking control of their military, which, I skipped this. I made kind of I alluded to the fact that America overthrew the government there in 2004 and in 2014. And it was under sort of these new sock puppet client governments where the American government was then invited to completely remake their military forces, at least in terms of their order of battle and their communications equipment and their command and control structures and all of this. So even though they didn't get a war guarantee as a member of the NATO alliance, they were clearly being made an auxiliary in the NATO alliance anyway. So in other words, if you had a full-scale war between NATO and the Russian Federation, the Ukrainian army would be incorporated into NATO's broader alliance, along with Hungary and Germany and the United States under Supreme Allied NATO command anyway. And so they were essentially making them de facto members by taking such a degree of control over their military. And then I don't know if this was really a threat or not, but it still made sense that even if the Russians were jumping to conclusions, that the Americans swore they were not going to put military forces into Eastern Europe when they expanded. They promised in 1997, and then what they do? They put these anti-missile missiles in Romania and Poland and the radars in the Czech Republic, and this is a threat to tip the balance away from mutually assured destruction to a first strike capability against Russia. And what if they try to put these missiles in Kharkiv? where they reduce flight times for a Tomahawk cruise missile to 10 minutes and for a hypersonic missile to 5. And the thing is about it, these anti-missile missiles, the Sparrows, are fired from what are called the Mark 41 or MK-41 missile launchers, which are dual-use launchers that can host Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. And so America was already in violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty at that point. And, well, certainly because Trump tore it up. So by the time Biden got there, the treaty wasn't even there anymore at all. And Putin's saying, well, what's to stop you from going ahead and putting these missiles just a 10-minute flight time from Moscow? I'm going to go ahead and call your bluff right now. And exactly as John Mearsheimer, the professor from the University of Chicago, predicted back in 2014 when he wrote about this in Foreign Affairs, and I interviewed him on my show about it in August of 14. And he said, listen, if America really tries to bring Ukraine into NATO, Russia will just wreck it. They will just invade and break the place so that you can't have it, right? That's what they'll do. Because they're just absolutely not going to tolerate this. And that is eventually what it came down to.
Right. So then that's why I don't know how this ends, because even if Donald Trump is able to convince Putin, I mean, from Putin's perspective, I just don't understand why the American system, every 4 years we get a new president, or, maybe 8 years, right? So, but this time we know for sure Trump's only there for 4 more. And then there's somebody else who comes in, and it could be Democrat or Republican. We don't know. And let's say it's a Republican. Let's say AOC wins. She becomes the Democratic nominee and she wins the damn thing. What do you think she's going to do? So even if Trump says all the promises in the world, Ukraine won't be in NATO, it's fine. We realize what happened here. We understand the fault. I mean, Trump's saying all these things, but we've got another side of the political spectrum that is deranged by anything Trump says, and anything he says, even if it's completely true and accurate, they just automatically go against it. So suddenly you've got Democrats in power and they're like, all right, we're once again putting Ukraine on the path to NATO membership. So why would Russia ever concede when we have such a mercurial political system here where it just changes all the time and you never know what the next guy is going to say?
Well, and when Donald Trump seeking peace is absolutely the aberration, right? Like he is, whatever he is, he ain't supposed to be there, right? He's just, he is, wealthy enough and famous enough and determined enough to make it happen in a way that there's no other figure in American life who could ever do that. You can be the president if you're a Clinton or a Bush or a Biden or a McCain and you're picked by the machine to be there. We all know how that works. Yeah. So what you're talking about isn't just it's mercurial, it's that he is this aberration. And once he's gone, the default is back to the Joe Biden, John McCain position on Russia. And so, yes, that's all the more reason for Russia to just keep winning then, because why make a deal if you don't believe that it can really stick? If Trump makes a deal, is he going to sign a treaty?
Yeah.
Where he promises never to bring Ukraine into NATO? Probably not. And the Senate's going to ratify one? No, probably not. And so, yes, I think you're right. And all of this argues toward Biden should have prevented this damn thing from breaking out, because I don't think
seems like all of them should have. Seems like it just should have from the very beginning, from HW. But yeah, I just don't see how Russia. It's going to
be a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians in the end too. I think they're going to regret removing the entire pro-Russian population out of Ukraine and leaving a rump Nazi state. Again, by the laws of government upward failure, at the point where they take the whole southern coast and all of the east, now what have they left? They've left, Volhynia and Galicia, which are these areas in the far west of the country where the people are far right-wingers who absolutely hate their guts and who they're going to have just, there used to be a balance. Again, their guy used to win elections. That's why we had to intervene. Now there's going to be no balance. Now it's going to be the further right you are, the better position you are to gain power in the new Ukraine.
Well, that's why they almost have to take the whole thing. I mean, they might just have to say, all right, we have to take all of Ukraine.
That's right. They're going to say, look, we have to denazify the place. So we're marching all the way to Romania and Poland.
I mean, I don't know what else. I don't know any other option for Russia, honestly. And I would love to see the end of this war. I've been advocating for the end of this war. But then when I really stopped to think about it, I'm like, okay, well, if you're Putin in Russia, how do you end this thing? You can't. You have to take the whole thing.
I hate to say it, but I predicted this. I gave a speech, a 2-hour-long speech like 4 days after the war started. I guess it was in very early March of 22, where I predicted that same thing. It's just the laws of it's what it is it's Austrian school economic analysis applied to foreign policy. Everything that government does is, and it's just the same with the Russians as it is with us. Everything they do causes some big distortion and some big problem, and then they always forget why it's their fault. And so they always go, instead of undoing the thing they did, they go to the next step. And then they make things worse and worse and worse and worse. And so from the Russian point of view, they're going to end up with NATO on their border anyway, because they're going to move their border to NATO.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can't really prevent that. And the other thing, too, is why would Russia want to, at this point, look at trying to reestablish or not reestablish, but just have good relations with the United States when our presidents do flip so often, unlike China. And look, I'm not advocating for a dictatorship by any means, but there's stability in it, right? There's stability in China's Xi Jinping being in power for decades on end. There's stability even with Putin being in power in Russia for decades on end. We don't have that sort of a system. And look at what happens. Trump gets into office, and the first thing he does, and the same thing when Biden got into office, the first thing they do is they take their executive order pen and they start undoing everything the last guy did. So every 4 years, we could be in this cycle of, okay, now we're in a treaty. Now we're out of a treaty. Now we made a promise. Now we're out of that promise. Now we keep doing this over and over. We don't have, and again, I'm not advocating for a dictatorship by any means, but it does make it very difficult to do deals around the world when the deals could quickly be undone when the next person takes power. So why would Russia say, okay, we're going to normalize relations with the United States. We're going to be friendly. We're going to do business. We're going to start relying on that sort of business, that economics with the other country when, a couple of years in, suddenly it flips and you're cut off and you're sanctioned again. China, you don't have that problem, right? And so you're better off being friends with China.
Yeah, you are right about that. I mean, it's a mixed bag because, again, Trump really is an aberration. If you go through from Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama to Biden, there's a lot of continuity there. I mean, there's really a centrist establishment consensus. On the other hand, W. Bush tore up Bill Clinton's deal with North Korea, and Barack Obama tore up W. Bush's deal with Libya, and Donald Trump tore up Barack Obama's deal with Iran. Yeah. And Joe Biden tore up everything that Donald Trump was trying to do, and with as far as getting along with Russia, that was for sure. So, I mean, when it comes down to it, even if it's just one or two, they all do something terrible. And Trump tore up Nixon and Reagan's great nuclear treaties, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Open Skies Treaty. Well,
so here's a good question. Here's a question for you. I know you also follow everything in foreign policy, but Israel, and since we have clearly such a very bought off and bribed or blackmailed government that is in the pocket of Israel, what do you think Israel wants us to do when it comes to Russia? It seems to me that they would want us to have a good relationship with Russia and stop waging proxy wars with Russia so that we can instead wage wars on their behalf and go into a war with Iran. Israel and Russia have a very close relationship. What, a third of the population
in Israel?
Yeah, exactly. It's like a third of the population or something. They're actually Russians that are living in Israel. I mean, Russian is the second largest language, I think, spoken in Israel behind
it's their
Hebrew.
Ancestral homeland, Kim.
Right. So what do you think? I mean, if Israel is in control of some of this foreign policy, Trump is clearly one of the most bought off, unfortunately, politicians in the pocket of Israel and the Israel lobby, the Adelson money, all of that. Do you think that that's part of the reason why Trump is trying to end the war with Russia and Ukraine, because the Israelis really want to see the end of that war, so that we could then refocus on waging war with Iran?
Makes sense. I haven't seen any direct indication of that it's really the Israel lobby pushing for peace in Ukraine in that sense.
I think Trump genuinely doesn't like war. I think he actually, as a person, doesn't like war. That's the sense I get from him, is that he really doesn't want to get involved in anything, and he wants to get us out of all these wars. And I think that's what the frustrating thing is for the Israelis, because they really want war with Iran. And they thought that they could get it with Trump because Trump's willing to do so much more for them. But it's almost like that's the line where he's like, okay, yeah, but I'll give you the West Bank, I'll give you Jerusalem as your capital, I'll give you all these things, I'll give you Gaza, I'll give you everything, but I won't give you war with Iran.
Yeah, and maybe I'll give you war with Yemen. I'll do that for you. But Iran it's just too much. And I wish I had good sources on this. And if there's been good journalism on this, I don't know about it. Maybe there are some stories about this that I've missed, but I have to imagine that the Army and the Marines are telling him, no, man, we don't want to fight Iran.
Yeah, no kidding.
Like, maybe the Air Force and the Navy talk big, but they're not the ones who got to really die in the thing the way the soldiers do. And we just have $1 zillion worth of military and civilian assets all up and down the west coast of the Persian Gulf there. We have tens of thousands of men and who knows how much equipment in Kuwait. We have the 5th Fleet stationed at Bahrain. We have the Air Force and Central Command stationed at Qatar. We have bases in UAE and in Saudi Arabia as well. And then we got, trillions of dollars worth of economic targets all up and down the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and Qatar, and all of those oil producing states there, all of which are some degree of hostage of Iranian missiles. Now, maybe that's all a paper tiger. Maybe America can just shoot them all down and bomb all the warehouses and the Iranians are just completely inept and don't know how to shoot straight. But I'm not really willing to bet on that. And I don't think that the Pentagon is either. Now, there was a time where we had 150,000 troops in Iraq and another 50,000 in Afghanistan, which is another major disincentive to attack in Iran, especially when we were fighting the Iraq War for the Shiites and the Dawa Party and the Supreme Islamic Council, Muqtada al-Sadr, where if we had bombed Iran, our guys would have get shot in the back like Order 66 in Revenge of the Sith, right? Where like they're going to choose the Iranians over the Americans in event of that conflict. So we don't have that anymore, although we do still have some guys in Iraq. It's just a couple of thousand. You might even get them out of the way first. And I think they're probably mostly safely up in Kurdistan anyway. But still, the number of men and the amount of equipment in Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi, and all that, I think all that is at least at risk in the event of a war with the Israelis. And, just lately I've had the occasion to do a couple of TV shows arguing with Israeli hawks and pro-Israeli hawks. Like one of them was Alan Dershowitz, and the other was a guy, Jonathan something, from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And they deny that Israel's trying to get America to bomb Iran. They just want America to maybe help Israel do it. And it's like, no, that's not true. Israel doesn't have the capability to do it. You need American heavy bombers to drop the 30,000-pound non-nuclear bunker busters to get down into those deep underground facilities. And you would need the Americans to lead the whole thing, provide all the logistics. And of course, the Israelis are all flying American planes anyway. So we're implicated in the whole thing. Everybody knows that Israel can't just launch the war without permission from the United States. And working with us to do it. And not
only that, but Israel always uses the excuse of, well, we're in our own war, so we can't. We've got, and they get themselves into this, right? They're bombing the hell out of Gaza, going after Lebanon. They're all over the place, and they say, well, because we're too busy doing what we have to do for our area, and so you have to do that one over there while we're over here doing this.
Sure. Netanyahu, he's kind of hard to read on this. I mean, he's made a lot of threats over the years. I think he absolutely had the Obama government convinced that he was going to attack in 2012. At one point, he had David Wormser talking about doing an end run around W. Bush and forcing, in fact, this was during Ehud Olmert, where the neocons were talking about doing an end run around W. Bush and getting Israel to attack Iran, forcing Iran to respond against American targets and drag Bush kicking and screaming into the thing when he didn't want to do it. And the Pentagon had told him they didn't want to do it. And so, but then again, Netanyahu's entire doctrine revolves around stealing all of Palestine and yet being able to normalize relations with all the Sunni Arab states anyway, right? Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin said, we have to deal with the Palestinians so that we can get along with the Jordanians and the Saudis and the rest. And Netanyahu, remember in his big speech right before October 7th, his big speech on September 22nd at the United Nations, he held up a picture of Israel where the West Bank and Gaza Strip were all one color with the rest of Israel. And he said, this is the new Middle East. I won. And he draws a line. He says, all these Sunni states are all now normalizing relations with Israel in the Abraham Accords. And so the lesson to the Palestinians is, you lose. I win. Nobody's coming for you. All these countries who were holding out that they wouldn't negotiate with me and normalize with me until I made a deal with you, well, they're all selling you out now. So how do you like that? That was the whole point of the speech, was that he was getting away with it. But a huge part of that is building this coalition around the threat of the Ayatollah in Iran and what he might do, and building a Sunni alliance to contain the Shiite crescent that, of course, W. Bush made 100,000 times more powerful by doing Iraq War II and putting their best friends in power in Baghdad at the expense of the Sunnis who had ruled under Saddam Hussein. And so they had put up Iranian power so much in the region. Now that's actually good for Israel. In fact, someone showed me a memo one time. I should have saved this. I bet I could find it again. There was a document one time that had, I think it was an American document describing what they thought was Israeli thinking, which was that they support Iran in the Iran-Iraq war while America supports Saddam Hussein against them. But they don't really want Iran to win. They just want both sides to keep fighting and weaken each other. But they said, but you know, if Iran does win the Iran-Iraq war and they sack Baghdad, well, that wouldn't altogether be a bad thing, because at least it would help drive the Sunnis into our arms. So as long as Iran is there, that's a reason for Israel's neighbors to get along with Israel at the threat of Shiite theocracy to their east. Without that, they were able to get a real war, or really even just decimate their military and defenestrate them, or even achieve a regime change in Tehran, then they lose that common enemy. Right. And then all these countries have no reason to get along with Israel anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I actually have some Iranian contacts that have claimed to me that the government of Iran is actually totally in bed with Israel, that this is all just a ruse, that they need each other and they need to pretend. Basically, it's kind of like Russia and the United States. They're not really friends, but there's a real benefit to having this never-ending Cold War that fuels the military-industrial complex. There's a lot of benefit in having this go on and on and on. And their argument was that inside of Iran, inside the government, much of it is actually controlled or friendly, you know, that they use this constant clash in order, for one, for the Iranian regime to stay in power. It's that, well, we can't have issues, we can't have these, you know, because we're always at threat, they're going to come and get us. So it allows them to continue remaining in power as a theocracy. And then it also allows the Israelis to build up their weapons, to siphon money from the United States. We're always at threat. We're always at threat. We need more money. We need more money. Help us out. Give us more weapons so that they can then do what they really want to do. I mean, Iran's way far away from them. What they really want to do is clear out all the land and get rid of all the Palestinians and start taking maybe even Lebanon and Syria, right?
And they can always change the subject to Iran anytime anybody brings up Palestine. Remember, Obama gave his big Cairo speech. So we're going to do a two-state solution. They said, what about Iran? What about Iran? What about Iran? He said, okay, we'll do Iran first. And then what they do? They opposed him the whole time he tried to do Iran. And when he did the nuclear deal, he finally got the nuclear deal done in 2015. And now there's no time to do Palestine left anymore. You know, it's always like that. And listen, what you say might sound conspiratorial or whatever, but there's absolutely precedent for that. Israel and Iran covertly stayed friends after the Iranian Revolution all the way through 1993. Yeah. And
people don't know that. They don't realize that they actually had they'd remained very friendly with each other behind closed doors.
That's right. But on TV, they were threatening to kill each other all the time. And in fact, it's really important. Everyone has got to read this book, I swear. If anybody listens to one word I said on this show this whole time, read Treacherous Alliance by Trita Parsi. It is such a fantastic book, telling the story of America, Israel, and Iran from the level of the highest grand strategists in charge. There's none of this news cycle garbage to muck up the story. It's all about
Trita's coming. He's coming on the show next week, so maybe I'll have him. I'll have him lay all this out.
This is the best book I've ever read about the Middle East, and I've read a hell of a lot of books about the Middle East, lady. And he just shows, like, the anecdote that sticks out of my mind is the Ayatollah Khomeini, the mean old Ayatollah, goes on TV and goes, "You Jews, I'm going to destroy Israel. You just watch." And then that same day, he's taking a shipment of missiles from Israel. And so that's actually why he's threatening them on TV. Is to, like, look at this hand over here, to distract from the fact that he's actually all the way naked under the covers in bed with the Israelis at that moment, you know?
Yeah, so there's a lot of people that think that's been going on. Well, there's some people, I should say, that are well positioned inside of the Iranian government, whatnot, that I have contact with, who make that claim of, no, this is all for show. We're still
I'll
very
tell you what
much.
Greg Palast said. Greg Palast is sort of a progressive journalist. He used to work for the BBC and stuff, and he's an expert in energy markets and scandal and politics, especially oil and stuff. And I remember him telling me way back in the Bush years, he goes, "Well, you know, British Petroleum just invested $15 billion in building all this infrastructure in Iran. Let me tell you something. Britain is not about to go to war against British Petroleum. Okay? That's not how that works." So, in other words, the Ayatollah, Bush wouldn't do business with him. Bush wouldn't let Boeing move in there. But Blair would let BP move in. Mm-hmm. And that was the Ayatollah's insurance policy right there. Come on, you don't want to attack me now. And that was why, you know, when they did the nuclear deal, the first thing he did was buy as much spare parts from Boeing as he could for their aging fleet. They need the parts so bad. And there were people, I'm trying to remember, I had a fun anecdote about this, but I got Biden brain so bad. But there was a fun thing where we were joking about on the show. This is what we need, is the peace industrial complex. We need for Boeing, who are the worst warmongers next to Lockheed and Northrop, right? We need Boeing to invest more heavily in peace with Iran. Yeah. The more they're trading with Iran, the less likely it is that Obama's predecessor, whoever that might be, could bomb them, right? And then that's one of the things that Donald Trump did when he came in, was put these crippling sanctions on, did everything he could to prevent Boeing or anybody else. He was not going to let them call those shots. He was going to call them. Netanyahu was going to call them. And, you know, by the way, Netanyahu absolutely lied when in 2018, they did this ridiculous press conference where they claimed that they had stolen all these secret papers from a warehouse outside of Tehran that proved that they had a secret nuclear weapons program. Nuh-uh. All it was the same old alleged studies documents that the Israelis themselves had forged and had purported to be on a stolen Iranian scientist's laptop that proved all this stuff about Iran's nuclear weapons program that never did exist, and every bit of it had been debunked. And all they were doing was taking those same alleged studies accusations and just recycling them again. But Donald Trump and his people didn't know anything about all of the technical details of that stuff. And so he fell for it and tore up the treaty in 2018. Now he's trying to get back into a deal. But, I mean, we have a deal. You know, the deal was with the entire UN Security Council. It wasn't just with the United States. So Iran is still in the deal, technically, with the rest of the Security Council powers, although as per the deal, they're not abiding by every one of its restrictions as long as America is in violation of the deal. Right. So they're not even breaking the deal to break the deal, because the deal says that they can break it without leaving it. If America doesn't abide by our part, they don't have to abide by theirs. And so that was part of the thing negotiated in the first place. So in other words, we have a deal for America to just get back in. Right? Like, what do we, and I know that looks bad from the Republicans' point of view. They've demonized the damn deal so much. Says the worst deal in all world history and this and that. But what are they going to do? They're going to start from scratch and have a whole new deal when all the deal says really is they're adding additional protocols to Iran's safeguards agreement with the IAEA, because they already had one, because they were already members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so after Kerry and Zarif spent 2 years going back and forth for for all that shuttle diplomacy to push that Iran deal through, all they did was sign an additional protocol and some subsidiary arrangements that they added to their safeguards agreement, which just essentially scaled back their nuclear program some and expanded inspections vastly, and just to guarantee the civilian nature of their program. I mean, the most important part of it, as far as nuts and bolts go, is they turned off all their heavy water reactors, so they're not producing weapons grade or any kind of plutonium, which would still have to be refined, but they're not producing plutonium waste that could be turned into weapons fuel.
Yeah.
And their enriched uranium, they shipped it all out of the country to France to have the French then turn it into fuel rods and ship it back, which is important because it means that Iran then would only have enough fuel rods to use currently. And then once they're spent, they'll get another batch shipped in. But meanwhile, they don't have a stockpile of enriched uranium that they could then continue to enrich up to weapons grade. And so if they wanted to break out towards a nuclear weapon, they'd have to basically start from scratch, having no store of uranium to begin to work with. They'd be, have to go back to the refinery. And so this was to lengthen the amount of time that it might take for them to make a bomb if they chose to try to make one. So I have no idea what they're really talking about in Oman as they're trying to deal with this. But I think it's highly doubtful that they're going to be able to replace the old deal with a new bilateral deal with just America and Iran that's going to supersede and actually literally somehow be an improvement on the previous deal. It seems very doubtful to me.
It'll be the same deal, but Trump will just say, well, it's a new deal. And all the Republicans will say, yeah, okay, good job. And
he's got to get the whole Security Council to re-sign it and everything. And, honestly, all he had to do the first time was just stay within the deal, be nice to the Ayatollah, and say, listen, this deal ain't so bad, but I wish it was better. And now that we're getting along, you know what I'd really like you to do? I'd like you to cancel some of the sunset provisions in there. You promise that you won't enrich up to this amount until this date. How about we just make that permanent? And you say that you're going to reduce your number of centrifuges at Natanz till this date. Why don't we make that permanent?
Yeah, but see, this is
a research facility instead of a production facility. Let's get rid of some of those sunsets. Then we could move forward. If Donald Trump had done that in 2018, I bet you the Ayatollah would have gone along.
I'm sure they would have. But it goes against what I had said earlier, which is that Israel needs Iran to be a bad guy so that they can continue getting more weapons, and they can go after the Palestinians, they can go after Hezbollah, they can go after all of these different groups, saying that they're all backed by Iran. Iran's their great enemy, and they're clearing out all these land areas that they really want for themselves. I mean, they need Iran to be a giant enemy. So it works in their favor to just say, go cancel that deal so that we have the big bad enemy again, so that we can then ramp up our escalations against all of these other proxies that we're going to go take out. I mean, that's exactly the story that Trita tells in Treacherous Alliance. He says, they had what was called the strategy of the periphery, which meant that they wanted to be allies with Turkey, Iran, and Ethiopia in order to divide the attention, basically, of Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, that they would have to face their enemy on the opposite flank from Israel, right? Yeah.
But then Yitzhak Rabin turned that around in the early 1990s, and he turned the strategy of the periphery into, actually, no, we want to make friends with the Sunni Arab states, the closer Arab states, but in order, and including make peace with the Palestinians so that we can make peace. And I admit, he was not trying to really give the Palestinians a real second state.
Yeah.
But it was like a pseudo two-state solution. It was a hell of a lot better than anything that's been on offer since 1995, I'll tell you that. But he said, we have to do that so that we can normalize with the rest of the Sunnis. Now he actually made a deal with the King of Jordan in 1994. They have a permanent peace with Jordan since 94. It was part of that process that he was trying to do. And, but in order to do that, he had to have somebody to demonize. So that was when he started pointing the finger at the Ayatollah. And it was only after that the Ayatollah got mad and started financing Hamas. He didn't start financing Hamas until 1995. So he's like, oh, how are you going to get a two-state solution now when Arafat doesn't speak for these kooks, and all I got to do is give them a few $1,000 and they'll go blow up a bus full of civilians and ruin everything, right? And so that was Iran playing the Hamas card in order to screw the Israelis when the Israelis had turned on them for no good reason other than as a matter of strategy and for their own personal reasons. And it ended up backfiring on them. And then, of course, a Netanyahu fan murdered Rabin. And then, as Treatise shows, with beginning with Netanyahu, I don't know what Shimon Peres was going to try to do, but he wasn't in power for very long. But once Netanyahu was in there, and then even after it was Ehud Barak, and then it's been essentially Likud ever since then, because then it was Sharon after Barak, and even though he created his own party, Kadima, he was still Ariel Sharon, the butcher of Beirut, and then his successor, Ehud Olmert, had been Sharon's right-hand man. So he was not really much of a dove compared to Netanyahu. He was essentially still a right-wing nationalist. He was not a labor guy. He was a right-winger, along with Sharon and Netanyahu and Likud. So it's essentially been those guys in charge the whole time. And so then they took Rabin's cue of, hey, let's demonize the Iranians. But they said, let's demonize the Iranians so that we don't have to deal with the Palestinians, rather than as cover for dealing with them. And so anytime anybody says, hey, we need a two-state solution, they go, yeah, but what about the Ayatollah? And they do it over and over again. I mean, that's the story of your lifetime, right? You've heard it a million times.
Yeah. So fascinating. Scott, we could go on forever because you are just a wealth of information. But we have to cut it. But I wish we could have gotten into, there are so many other conflicts, but I think we did such a deep discussion about these two in general, Russia, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, that, I mean, you just are such a wealth of information. Have you written a book about Iran, Israel yet?
No, I do have, in my previous book, Enough Already, I had an Iran chapter that didn't really fit anywhere. So I took all its sections and sprinkled them throughout the book. So there are different takes. I have a take on their nuclear program for you and their intervention in Iraq War II and other things like that. So there's quite a bit about Iran there. And then Israel is in the background of Enough Already, but I don't have a full write-up on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict itself.
Or just Israel. You should just do a book on Israel control, how they've controlled our foreign policy for so long. I mean,
there's a lot of that in there. There's a lot of real conservatives as the vanguard of the Israel lobby in the United States and the authors of Iraq War II. And Obama's dirty war in Syria as well.
Well, the latest book is Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. That is available. We do have the link down below. Also, there's a Kindle version available for people. Do you have it in audio yet? Have you read the book in audio and people can do the Audible?
Thank you so much for asking. It's not all the way out in Audible yet because the thing is 477,000 words, and so it's taking me a long time to read. But I'll tell you this, at my Substack, which is scotthortonshow.com, I have the first 3 sections, which is all of H.W. Bush and all of Bill Clinton, and that's 10 hours worth. Wow. So that's longer than the audiobook of my previous book. So
that's the first 3 sections. How many sections are there?
Well, there's a chapter for each president. So right now there's just 3 sections have been published so far because Bill Clinton was so massive that had to be part 1 and 2 of Bill Clinton. So it's 3 sections. But that's all of H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And I have the audio of most of W. Bush recorded, but not edited yet. And I have some other projects that are getting in my way. But I promise I'm slogging my way through and doing the audio. So people subscribe at scotthortonshow.com. They can begin to listen to the audiobook of Provoked there. Okay, great. Because I'm an audio book listener. I like to clean my house and listen to the audiobooks. That allows me to get things done while I listen to books. So I like to read too. I'm a big reader, but I just busy. Got to clean the house. Got to do things. Of course. Scott Horton, thank you again for being here. We do have all those links down below. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you. Good to talk to you again. Thanks for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can check out Monday through Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern. The show airs live. It is a 1-hour live show Monday through Friday. Just head to KimIversonShow.com. See you there.